Hello, I'm Sue Nelson, and welcome to another edition of the Planet Earth podcast, which, despite being inside University College London, will be filled with the sound of bats. Plus, why studying telomeres at the end of chromosomes can explain why some birds can live up to 50, and how counting down from 5 can help atmospheric science.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go!
Launching weather balloons and unmanned aerial vehicles to come from Sarah Moller's audio diary on the Isle of Arran. But first, bats. I was totally surprised to discover that 1 in 5 mammals is a bat, especially as the bat population is declining. Yet these secretive nocturnal creatures are not the easiest to see for yourself, especially not at this time of year when they're likely to be hibernating. But once they're awake, we'll be ready, as recently ecologists developed the first bat call identification software that can be used throughout Europe. I'm joined by Professor Kate Jones, Chair of Ecology and Biodiversity at University College London, and Charlotte Walters from the Zoological Society of London to discuss the software and how we can all become bat detectives. Charlotte, it's called iBats ID. How does it work?
We collected an echolocation call library of calls from species all over Europe, collected in lots of different habitats and in different situations. And we used this to train the software to identify differences between the different calls. So then when we introduce unknown calls to the software, it can tell us which species it is and with a probability of how certain it is.
So each species of bat has its own unique identification.
Yes, they all have calls that vary slightly. Some species, the calls are really different, so we can play you some of the calls. If we play a rhinolophus call, it sounds like this.
It almost sounds like Morse code, doesn't it?
Yeah. And a different type of bat, a pipistrellus, has calls which sound like this.
Now that sounded more like a bird.
Yeah, like a cheep.
Yeah.
But these calls are slowed down 10 times, so you've got to imagine the actual sound the bat's making is 10 times faster and 10 times higher pitch than these sounds. But you can tell that there's differences between the calls that we can use for identification purposes.
Now, Kate, you were sort of in charge there with your finger on the mouse, playing at some of those calls. You can actually see on your computer screen what the echo looks like as well.
What we're using here is transforming the actual raw data, the raw sounds. So we're using an FFT transform, so fast Fourier transform of the data, which takes tiny bits out of each of the raw data. So it becomes a much simpler signal. So it turns out that when you do that with bat calls, they tend to have a characteristic shape. So the ones which you heard before, the kind of ee that were a constant frequency, they look very flat. But when you have calls which have got a more chirpy sound, they have bits of FM frequency modulation, so they sound more chirpy. So that's where you get kind of a vertical line straight down, and then you may get a bit of constant frequency at the end. So if I just play these again, you can kind of hear that. And then these are the flat ones.
Now, how do you distinguish between that sort of noise and background noise that's at night, be it other mammals or birds or insects?
Well, bats are really good at that. It's really easy to do that for bats because bats are echolocating in frequencies and calling in frequencies which are much, much higher than anything else. We'll hear up to, say, 20 kilohertz, and bats kind of start at 15 all the way up to over 200. So there's very little else that's in those bands of frequencies. There are other calls that bats make as well. So some of them do searching calls, which we've been showing you, but some of them also will do social calls to talk to each other, which
Can I hear some of those?
Tend to be a bit lower, yes. These are social calls which they make to attract mates or to communicate with each other, which are more trill-like. You also get bats which, when they're searching, they'll emit a kind of search phase call and get the echo back so that they can figure out where they are and where their food is. But when they get closer to an insect or an object, they need much more information about it. So they'll do a kind of feeding buzz. So on some detectors it sounds like someone blowing a raspberry, so like that. But I'll just play it in real, for real. So these
that sounds like a budgerigar.
So there are all these different kinds of sounds. So at night you may also see or hear some insects as well. So this is an insect call. And some are like car alarms. So.
That's incredible. I had no idea that there were so many different sounds. And there is now a way that a sort of citizen science that people can help identify these bats as well. It's quite recently, this.
We have all these volunteers that go out and collect data in a monitoring program called iBats, and we get the data back, and we have over 2 million files that they send us.
Wow.
So what we try and do is go through it with some automatic filters, but those filters aren't very good at the moment. So what we're trying to do is to develop new ways of going through them automatically and then trying to link it up to iBats ID so that it's all one tool. So at the moment you go through, you find a call, you take the parameters and then you feed it into the software ID tool. But actually what we want to do is to integrate that all together. So the first step on that is to look at all the files and try to label all that data. You can imagine doing that with 2 million files is absolutely impossible. So we have launched a new site called Bat Detective, which anyone can log on and help us look at bats. So you go onto the site, sign in, and then you can help us classify where these calls are and hunt for these calls in the recordings. So you only occasionally get a bat, but they're full of other things as well which we don't really know about. So it's been really interesting. So it's been going on for about a month now, and we've had over 600 people sign up already, and we've had 57,000 classifications done.
Wow. So it's a bit like what people do with galaxies, the classification of galaxies.
Absolutely,
and looking for extraterrestrial planets. You can do that online, you can help identify.
Yeah, so anyone can listen to bats now. So we've slowed down the sounds so that you can hear them, and then we've just opened up all our data for them to have a look at and help us. And we create... there's a blog and some chat rooms as well, so we get people engaged, and people are getting really, really interested and going away finding out things we didn't know or finding things we didn't know.
I'd read, Charlotte, that bats have been called the equivalent of a canary in a coal mine because they're good indicators of the environment we live in. Is this right?
Yeah, bats are really sensitive to environmental change. So for a number of reasons, one of them is a lot of bats are insectivorous, so they depend on their insect prey, and insects are very climate sensitive. So with climate change happening, changes of insect distributions will also knock onto bats, so they're really good indicators of climate change. They're also very sensitive to things like land use change and humans going and kind of converting land into areas for human use, because they lose a lot of the habitats they need for roosting and for feeding and foraging. So they're really sensitive to all these changes going on in the environment. So if we look at bat populations and they're declining, that tells us that something's going on in the environment and can indicate a kind of a greater problem that's going on with biodiversity in general.
Kate, this is a great start. You've obviously got a fantastic project going on here. How many bat calls are there to be detected? Have you just sort of scraping the tip of the iceberg here with bat calls?
There are, over 40 species of bats in Europe, which is nothing because there's over 1,200 species of bats. So one of my PhD students is off in Mexico collecting data from there in different field sites in there, and there are about 140 species in one area in Mexico. So this is just the start of this, and that's why we need lots of help and lots of people to donate calls and to really look at the kind of complexity and the evolution of sound that's emitted by bats.
Can you just play me what you would say would be your favourite bat call?
Well, what I'm going to play you is a variation on that FM, constant frequency sound, but it's recorded with another type of detector, And this type of detector kind of loses a lot of the signal, but produces some amazingly different sounds. So I'm going to play you this, so then you can tell me what you think it sounds like.
It sounded like an alien.
But that's exactly the same sound as this one, but just with a different detector.
So which is the truest representation? This one. So yes, so you can see the difference then in terms of what you're getting. My goodness.
So it really means that...
Maybe that's why so many people think ET exists. They're listening to bats.
So it really makes a difference, the types of detector that you use. So we use these really kind of high-tech ones which record the actual sound. But a lot of volunteer groups use cheaper ones which do this to the signal, and you can't get as much information out about them.
Professor Kate Jones and Charlotte Walters, thank you both very much indeed. Atmospheric science plays an important role in our understanding of climate, air quality and weather. It's a discipline that covers physics, chemistry and mathematics, and those who study atmospheric science must also learn the practical aspects too. And that's where Sarah Moller comes in. She's the Education and Development Manager for the National Centre for Atmospheric Science, and recently she spent 2 weeks helping 29 students on the Scottish Isle of Arran, taking atmospheric measurements using balloons and unmanned aerial vehicles. Here we join Sarah preparing for a balloon launch with theodolites, a movable telescope that measures angles.
We'll go meet at the front in a minute. Yeah?
I'm waiting for the balloon tracking activity to start. So what I've got two groups of students, each huddled around something called a theodolite. And the idea is that the students are going to use these instruments to follow a helium balloon as it rises through the atmosphere. They're going to take measurements of different angles, and these can then be used to work out the position of the balloon. Hopefully this should give us some information about the wind speed and wind direction as you go up through the atmosphere. Now, for this to work, we need both theodolites to follow the balloon for long enough so that we can get enough information to see what's happening with the wind speed and direction. So I'm hoping that both teams are now up to speed and are going to be able to follow the balloon for a decent distance.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go!
Yeah, clock. Okay, hang on. Is that going down? No, I've lost it. Unlock.
We're behind a cloud, we're behind a cloud.
Each of the two teams that are doing balloon tracking have about 6 people in them, and each person has a different job. So for instance, what they have to do when the balloon is let go, it shoots up through the atmosphere. It's really hard to track to begin with, so somebody has to spin the theodolite round and make sure that the telescope on it is pointing towards where the balloon is. And then once the person who's looking through the eyepiece can see the balloon in the telescope, they say lock, and then they lock it in place. And after that, it won't spin around anymore. You can only move it with 2 little knobs. And as you move these 2 little knobs, different readings come up on a scale. So somebody reads out the scale and somebody else is looking through the telescope and winding these little knobs to make sure that the balloon is always in the centre of the telescope. And that's how we get our measurements of where it's going and what's happening in the atmosphere. So Catherine and Chris have just been tracking balloons with theodolites. How did you find it?
It really makes me think about when they had to actually do this for meteorological purposes. And it makes me really happy that we are living in the day of science and not just looking at the sky.
No, it is. It does really inspire you and really make you think back to those days when people had to use this to make detailed atmospheric measurements and really put you in place there. To think that this was the frontier of science one day is a really inspiring thing to be part of.
So I'm looking at the Quest 200 unmanned aerial vehicle. It's basically made of polystyrene painted black and then thin layers of wood along the sides and along the top coated in plastic to protect it. Inside you've got a 12-volt power supply and all the electronics that you need to power the motor.
Just want to check the ailerons. Left. Right.
I'm in the lab and I'm talking to Barbara Brooks, who is working on the unmanned aerial vehicles, which she's going to take to South Georgia. Barbara, can you tell us what you've got on this science platform that you're going to put in the vehicle?
What we have is a system that will measure wind speed, wind direction, temperature, pressure and humidity all at a very fast rate. That's all very well, but we actually have to decouple the whole of the motion of the platform from these measurements, so I have to have an inertial navigation system, and that's also on board, and that's running at 50 Hertz. So I've got all these really fast data streams, they're all going into a little onboard computer.
And what are you going to be looking at when you go to South Georgia?
Well, we're primarily looking at gravity waves coming off the Allardyce mountain range. Most of the time you use radio sondes to do this, or remote sensing instrumentation like the LiDAR, but that doesn't give you a very high temporal or spatial resolution, nor does it allow you to get very close to, say, the surface of the ground. So what we're going to try and do is fly the UAV, and because it doesn't go particularly quickly, we can get high spatial resolution with this instrument and fill in the gap between where the radio sonde starts and where the LiDAR starts and where the ground is.
Thanks, Barbara.
Sarah Moller from the National Centre for Atmospheric Science. This is the Planet Earth podcast. Life's genetic code, or DNA, can be found tightly packaged inside chromosomes. At the end of these chromosomes are specialised bits of DNA called telomeres, and Pat Moynihan, Professor of Animal Ecology at the University of Glasgow, studies the length of these telomeres in birds. Birds are known for their long lives. Petrels, for instance, can live up to 40 or 50 years. But by studying Australian zebra finches, whose average life expectancy is around 5 years, researchers can examine the relationship between telomeres and longevity.
You can think of the telomeres as a bit like the little plastic caps that you get on the ends of shoelaces. Also, if you were tying your shoelaces in the dark, you can feel the plastic caps. Now, these telomeres do the same kind of job inside a cell for the cell machinery. They identify the chromosome ends, and they also protect the DNA from a number of processes that cause the ends to, in effect, fray, if you like.
Apart from the protection aspect of what they do, they're often associated with ageing, though, as well. Why?
Yes, they are. And one of the reasons is that every time the cell divides, the telomere gets a little bit shorter. Eventually, it will get so short that it doesn't work anymore, that then the whole genome becomes unstable and the cell doesn't function anymore, and it enters a state of what's called replicative senescence. That just means it can't divide anymore. Sometimes the cell dies, sometimes it stays there, but it's not quite working in the same way. So the loss of telomeres is associated with an age-related decline in tissue function.
Pat examines what factors are involved in the loss of telomeres, be it environment or hereditary or stresses such as a change in the availability of food for zebra finches. She also led a UK team that tracked a group of these birds, measuring their telomere length from when they were young until they died of natural causes. And earlier this year, they discovered a correlation between length of telomeres and the longevity of a bird.
The best predictor of lifespan was that very first measurement of telomere length in early life.
Is this also as a result of when environment kicks in and when these other external stresses possibly affect your lifestyle in much the way with human beings as well?
Yes, there is a lot of work on telomeres in human beings, and I'm afraid that almost all the things that we know are bad for us are also bad for telomere length, so smoking, stress, lots of things are associated with reduced telomere length. However, when it comes to early life telomere length, we still don't really know to what extent growth conditions are influencing telomere loss, or whether the variation that we see is largely a consequence of inherited factors.
So work's ongoing then with a whole range of factors?
Yes, we're doing a number of different projects looking at different environmental conditions in the wild, animals born in different years, in different situations, in different brood sizes. And then also we're looking at the within individual changes using the zebrafinch.
There were a lot of suggestions when your research came out of the sort of possible connection to human ageing, and it almost being that in this case, when it comes to how long we live, size of telomeres does matter. Is that connection too easy to grasp. It's much more complicated than that.
One of the really interesting things, though, is that animals can restore telomere length. Now, in normal body cells, that's a very risky thing to do, because if you keep restoring telomeres, you run the risk that a cell can divide uncontrollably. And of course, that happens during cancer. It's thought that one of the reasons we don't have, for example, in human body cells, we don't have telomerase usually active, is it's a protective process. It keeps a check on cell division. However, in some much shorter lived animals, they do have telomerase active in their tissues. So yes, the basic processes are relevant to humans. People haven't done the kinds of studies that we have done in the zebrafinch in humans, that's to say, tracking telomere length in the same individuals from early in life until they die. The question about should we all run along and get our telomeres measured and say, okay, that predicts how long I'm going to live. Telomeres aren't everything. There are other things that go on. In humans, yes, there are relationships between life expectancy and telomere length, which have only really been studied in old individuals, because you don't want to have to wait forever to get the data on how long people live. So it's a very active area of biology, but I wouldn't waste your money on running out and getting your telomere length measured, because it's only going to make you either happy or miserable, but it scientifically isn't going to tell you exactly how long you're going to live. You might as well do something else with your money, I think.
Good advice for so many areas of life there from the University of Glasgow's Pat Moynihan. Well, that's it from this edition of the Planet Earth podcast from the Natural Environment Research Council. Don't forget to check out our Facebook and Twitter feed. I'm Sue Nelson, and before we go, here's a final bat call.